Hello and welcome to the RAI Book Club, which we're hosting here at the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford in collaboration with our friends in American Studies at the University of Sussex. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome our audience and our three speakers today who are joining us from Boston, Portland, Oregon, and Yellowknife, Canada. We're here to celebrate Joe Sacco's most recent book of graphic reportage, Paying the Land, which tells the story of the Dene people in the Canadian Northwest Territories and the legacies of both colonialism and resistance. And Paying the Land was a Guardian Book of the Year in 2020. Thank you too to our audience who are joining us from around the world. First of all, we'll hear some comments from our panel, and then we'll open out to the Q&A from the audience. So you're welcome at any point to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, on the right-hand side, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I'll introduce our panel. Many of you will recognize Paul Andrew from the book as Joe tells his story in Paying the Land. Paul was born in the Mackenzie Mountain and he spent 7 years at a residential school from the age of 8. Paul returned to his community and became chief at the age of 22. After many years as chief, Paul had a 30-year career with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, and his focus has been and still is on teaching Dene language and culture, building relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, and healing and reconciliation. Paul has received many awards, including the CBC Team Building Award, the Northwest Territories Literacy Award, and the National Aboriginal Achievement Award. And we're really honoured that he's joining us today. Hilary Chute is the Distinguished Professor of English and Art and Design at Northeastern University. She's the author of a number of books: Graphic Women, Life Narrative and Contemporary Comics, Outside the Box, Interviews with Contemporary Cartoonists, Disaster Drawn, Visual Witness Comics and Documentary Form, and Why Comics from Underground to Everywhere. And 3 of those 4 books have lengthy chapters on Joe Sacco. She is our Sacco expert today. And she's also the associate editor of Art Spiegelman's Meta Mouse. Joe Sacco really needs no introduction, but he's a Maltese American cartoonist credited as the creator of the genre of comics journalism. His works include Palestine, Safe Area Goražde, The Fixer, Footnotes in Gaza, and The Great War. Joe's work astounds audiences worldwide with his particular combination of journalistic reportage and incredible artistic skill. He's the recipient of prizes, including the American Book Award, the Eisner Award, and the Ridenhour Book Prize. I'm sure all of our audience is as excited as I am to hear our panel speak today about Paying the Land. So I will hand over to Paul to start us off.
Good morning from Yellowknife, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this very important book. And first of all, thanking the creator for another day. Our elders always talk about giving thanks, and thank you to the creator. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this particular book is that it talks about some of the issues that the Dene have to deal with. And one of the things that our elders have always talked about and continue to talk about to this very day is the need for dialogue. And sometimes dialogue is going to be tough and it's not going to be easy. And we see from the book, residential schools, for example, there's still a lot of people who have gone through that system that do not want to talk about the issue at all. And some of the social problems that we have. And again, it was very explicit in the book on some of the problems with social problems that we have. And the only way that we can deal with it, I believe, is to, first of all, acknowledge it, and then also to go along with it. And also some of the, I don't want to call it conflicts, but conflicting ideas on whether we should develop the land for economic purposes or can do it. Those are some things that are happening in the communities right now. And so one of the great things about the book that I found is that it continues to talk about it. And one of the things that I have experienced myself is to talk about some of these issues that are not easy, and to share it with outsiders is even more difficult, because for 600 years. I think indigenous people around the world, and for sure in northern Canada, is that we've tried to tell non-indigenous people what it's like to be exploited, what it's like to be used, abused, and misused. And nobody seems to hear us. And so for somebody else to come up and trying to talk about some of the issues once again is not only difficult, but why? Why should I do this? So, kudos to Joe for being able to get to some of these really important and really deep felt issues that were there. And I think one of the things that really comes out in the book for me is that on personal reconciliation. And I don't know what reconciliation means to anybody else, but for me, it is talking about healing. It is about talking about taking care of myself and being the kind of person that the people that I come from are. We come from amazing people, and I tell that to our young people on a regular basis. And a lot of people may not know that. Growing up on the land, it could be tough, but it's also beautiful. And the amazing thing about growing up on the land, and I try to articulate it in the book, is that despite some of the hardship, despite the tough times, the people that I grew up were happy. They sang songs. They always laughed. They teased each other. And one of the important teaching methods that they always had, and I hope that became clear, is that humor gets you away from the dark places, brings you back into the circle. And those are the kind of stuff that I thought was really important. And the ending of the book I really like, because one of the things that and I thought Joe did a really good job explaining that, was that here's a young man out on the land by himself. Now, if you look at it from the place in Yellowknife, you might say he's all alone out in the bush. And we might even say poor guy. But he knew, and other people, indigenous people particularly, and I'm sure a lot of other people know it too, he's not alone. He has the whole world around him. He has the water. He has the land. And that's the teachings of the people. You are never, ever alone, no matter where you are, no matter whether you're alone. So, and that's the thing that is that we have to be comfortable in our own skills. We have to be proud of who it is that we are. And we do not apologize for being indigenous. We do not apologize for being Dene. In fact, we are proud of it to the point that we're telling Canadians that we have something to offer to you. Are you willing to take it? And I think some of those issues that came out in the book was for me, it was really tough going through some of the residential school stuff again, because even though you deal with it, even though you hope that you get over it sooner or later, trauma is something you never ever get over. At least that's my experience, that it comes back on a regular basis. And it's really tough seeing some of the social problems that are in the community, and that was in the book again. It's really tough to see that, because the North is vast in landscape, but we have a small population. Almost everybody in each community is related by either blood or by marriage. And it goes to regions and even in the territories. So when somebody is hurting somewhere, we all feel it. And when somebody is going through some tough times with social issues, we all feel it. And it does bring back our own trauma. It does bring back our own, But one of the things that I hope came out clear with the book at the end was that despite what happened, despite what we're going through yesterday or today or right now, we can get over it. We come from amazing people. We can do that. They have gone through some tough times, and we will go through some tough times in the future. Part of our job is to teach the young people the traditional methods in how they got over some of the tough stuff. So a lot of times done. And the reaction from a lot of people that I know in Yellowknife has been really positive. A lot of people talking about the book and a lot of people talking about how many other Canadians will read it and trying to get other people so that, because I think it really does identify some of the basic issues that we're facing right now. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Should we pass over to Hilary?
Everybody, Paul, thank you so much for those comments, and thank you, Alice, for the invitation, and thank you, Joe, for doing this incredible book. I'm really happy to be a panelist today. So I was actually hoping to share my screen. Am I all set up to do that?
Yes, you should be.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Right, hang on a moment.
Thanks everybody for bearing with me. I'll just start talking. I am going to show just a few images from the book and make some informal comments about them from the perspective of thinking about the book's comics form and how the comics form is in conversation with or reflecting, in my view, some of the themes of the book. Okay, so let's see. Can everybody see this? Will someone give me a thumbs up? Okay, great. Now I apologize that over the body of you, Paul, drawn as a baby, it says uncorrected proofs. This is my version of the book in PDF form. So this is the opening page of Paying the Land. And for those of you who are joining us today who haven't read the book yet, first of all, you're in for an incredible reading experience. And second, I wanted to let everybody know that, as I just mentioned, this is a book that opens with an image of Paul Andrew as a newborn. This page is just so stunning. I just want to point out a few things about it. First of all, Joe, you are known for your drawings of faces, which I have interpreted in your work as a kind of ethical gesture to present people as individuals, to present particular people with distinguishing facial features, as opposed to just a group of people. And so it's so interesting that this book opens with another one of your faces, but it's the face of a baby with closed eyes. And so just to narrate a little bit about what happens in this first chapter, which is called You Find Yourself in the Circle, we get Paul Andrew's adult face 4 pages later. And then we continue to get scenes of his young life and his childhood and his community living on the land, interspersed with images of his adult face talking. And it's a beautiful chapter, and it's quite dramatic also because Paul isn't identified by his name until the very last page of the chapter. And the last page of the chapter rhymes with this first page. We see Paul Andrew's face, so he frames the chapter, and we also see the moose skin boat. But this time, on the last page of the chapter, when we see the moose skin boat, it's full of people. It's full of a community of people. And we see Paul Andrew as an adult, and his face is looking right out at readers, sort of locking our gaze. And so I also want to point out, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but Paul Andrew frames the entire book and not only the first chapter. So I'm so interested in thinking about the really powerful concepts of continuity that this book is about. And I think one way that Joe reflects that interest in continuity is through the kind of circular structure of the book itself. So the opening chapter is called You Find Yourself in the Circle, and the really moving last chapter is called The Circle is Closed. And Paul already referred to that chapter, and I think he was referring to this scene in which a young man named Eugene Boulanger has just shot a caribou, and he's in the Mackenzie Mountains, and he feels a strong sense of pride and respect for the animal and connection with his ancestors, and as he says, with souls who are not yet born. So that's a chapter in which we see Paul also come back. So you find yourself in the circle is the beginning, and the circle is closed is the end. So there's this kind of circular structure, at least in the chapters. Now, just a few other things about this particular page before I move on. There's something that Art Spiegelman said in a conversation with Joe last summer that was hosted at the Society of Illustrators in New York on Paying the Land. And he said that there's an intensity to Joe's drawing that exceeds the kind of intensity that we might see, for example, in a documentary film or other forms of documentary that feature images. And I just think that's evident from the moment we open the book with this image. I mean, first of all, we get the kind of incredible texture of the trees and of the ground and of the skin of the boat. My co-columnist Ed Park, reviewing Paying the Land for the New York Times Book Review, said it was worth the price of admission for trees alone. And I think you can see that here. You know, everything has such a profound level of detail, but the perspective of this drawing is also amazing. And this is something that can be drawn that can't really be replicated in other forms of media. So I always want to put my hands right up on the book, and I do it all the time. So these are almost life-size hands and arms, or at least for my hands and arms. And this baby, Paul, this image of Paul, he still has an evident umbilical cord. But whose arms and hands are these? Are these the arms and hands of the person who just delivered Paul into the world? Are these the arms and hands of a person who is holding the baby aloft with the umbilical cord still on the baby? I mean, this image puts us in this scene, not only through the detail, but through the perspective in a really profound way, so that we're there in a sense as readers, figuratively speaking, of course, but in this circle. So it's a very, very powerful beginning. I will show you a page briefly from the middle of the book, and then two images from the last chapter. So this is a page that is so striking to me. So this is in the chapter called A Savage Who Can Read, which is the first chapter that really delves into the history of the residential schools that Paul was just talking about. And what's so striking to me about this page, besides its really interesting form, right? So the text boxes sort of curve with the stairway, and they sort of run a diagonal along the truck, and then they come down and make a sort of T shape in the last panel. So it's a very interesting image with sort of things floating around and melding together. But it is so forceful because it's an image of a man who describes how a memory seems to whoosh into him and then whoosh out. And one thing that I think comics can do, and that we see really clearly on display here, is to show readers the interiority of a person and what it feels like to carry that kind of memory, and what it feels like to carry that kind of trauma, right? So that physical whoosh that goes in and out of this man who's so startled when this happens, when memory, flashes up, is something that we can recognize on the comics page in a way that would be really difficult in other media. So I feel like this page is an example of how comics can reveal the way the body carries memory and the way the body carries trauma in a really significant way. I also think it's worth pointing out that at the bottom of the panel, we see his fantasy of revenge on the person who abused him. This isn't something that happens in real life, but comics can put us in the perspective of his interiority so that we can see this fantasy and we can understand what a powerful fantasy it is, even if it's something that he doesn't enact in time and space. And that's a feature of his experience that we learn here that helps us to understand just how profound his wounds are. And so this page, I think, is just an incredible page for getting at the experience and the interiority and the subjectivity of people who have survived trauma. Now, this is a page that is really striking to me for a different reason. This is a page that appears in the last chapter of the book called The Circle is Closed. And for me, this is a very dramatic page. It might not look as dramatic as the first page with Paul Andrews' newborn self greeting the world, or the last page that we just saw. But this is a page of Joe visiting a diamond mine. And for those of you who haven't read the book, this diamond mine, during the process of extraction, creates an arsenic toxic dust that is highly, highly lethal. And so now the issue is how to get rid of that toxic dust, and the dust is being stuffed back into the mine. And as somebody who has read Joe's other work and is interested in how he positions himself in relation to the experiences of others that he narrates and visualizes and conveys through testimony, I was really, really struck by this page, which I think of as just sort of like the book is a slow burn, and then we get to this page. And so I just want to read you the first text box and then the last few text boxes. So he writes, I came to the Northwest Territories to visit the Dene, who at their most traditional have a perception of where they belong in the scheme of things that is more remote to me than anything I've encountered before. So I'd love to hear from Joe, if it's possible, when we open up the conversation, about that idea of more remote to you than anything you've encountered before. Something else that's so striking about this page is the us-ness of it. So in the last panel at the top, he writes that he has questions about my race, about us. What is the worldview of a people who mumble no thanks or prayers, who take what they want from the land and pay it back with arsenic? This is very dramatic and very moving, and I'm struck by how he includes himself in this worldview of a people whose worldview is clearly deficient, and deficient would be a kind way to put it. Joe, I feel like in your other works, you've often narrated conflict, particularly conflict about war, from the position of being a relative outsider. So not directly implicated in sort of the sides who are having the war or the, conflict. And here you're implicated and you're complicit in a way that feels different to me than your other works. So I would love to hear you talk about that. Now, the very last image I'll show, and then of course I want to leave lots of time to Joe, is this incredible image, which is related, I think, to what Paul was talking about earlier. I think he was talking about this episode with this young man named Eugene. So it strikes me that, Joe, your work, all of your work in this book in particular, is so much about scale. And you're able in such a fascinating way to make the landscape, to make the mountains, the Mackenzie Mountains, like in this page, a kind of present, vivid character, so to speak, for lack of a better term, in your work. It strikes me that many of your earlier works are place names, right? Safe Area Goražde, Palestine, Footnotes in Gaza. And this title isn't one place name in the same way, it's just the land. But, throughout this book, I loved these big views like we see here, these majestic views, these very moving views in which the human being is a small part of the land, but powerfully connected to it. And so I think I'll just say two more brief things. And one is about how this book offers different levels of information. And I feel like one level of information we can see on a page like this. The texture of the mountains, the texture of the trees, of the rocks, of the water. There's just an incredible role that detail plays in your book that helps your pages feel so vivid and so alive. But I'm also so struck in this book that in addition to these sort of majestic scale images, it's so fascinating to see people just living their lives in the background of the scenes that you draw, right? Like a woman putting on her coat in a cafe, people just going about their everyday lives in the corners and the spaces of the stories that you convey here. And so it strikes me that these different kinds of information, these sort of majestic views and these on the ground everyday views are something that we see intertwined here in a really interesting way. And the very last thing I'll say, I actually want to quote from the book. So I mentioned that this book, in my view, is so much about continuity. And I'm so interested in the ways that Joe formally gestures at that kind of continuity. And I was really struck by something that a woman named Kyla says in the book. This is towards the end, it's the second to last chapter. And she says that people are interested in traditional ways not based on nostalgia. And this is then a quote from her. She says, culture becomes meaningful when people see it as part of themselves, not as part of their history. And I think this came through in a really powerful way through comics and through the form of the book, in addition through fascinating statements like Kyla's. So thank you, everybody, and I will now turn it over to Joe and stop my screen share.
I guess I'm talking now. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to Hilary and Paul for those comments. I will refer to some of the comments in a minute, but first I just wanted to tell you what my reason for going up there was. Basically, I wanted to get away from drawing conflict specifically. And I thought, I'm interested in how the world is changing, how the climate is changing. And I thought it would be interesting to do a book about where resource extraction, where it matters the most at the beginning. And that's where it's extracted, which usually takes place where Indigenous people live. And I was interested in that relationship between Indigenous people and resource extraction. And my first inclination was to go to South America, because of course we hear about what a lot of companies around the world are doing there, including Canadian companies. Then I got a letter out of the blue. I got this letter out of the blue some years before from a woman named Shauna Morgan in Yellowknife saying, if you ever wanted to come up here, there are a lot of interesting things going on with Indigenous people and resource extraction. And I remember that letter and I thought, I wonder if Shauna is still around. And I just wrote to her and said, I might still be interested in coming up, because at that point I began to think maybe it would be interesting to do a comparative study between what's going on with Indigenous people in different places. And to be honest, I thought, oh, it's Canada. It's going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier story because it's just close and it's Canada. And more people are going to be speaking English. I'm not going to have a problem up there. And I went up there and I got to say, I was very quickly divested of that preconceived notion. I realized what a complicated issue it was. And it didn't take long to realize that it had much more to do. It was much more than just a story about resource extraction. It was about colonialism. And it was about how Canada tried very purposefully to break people from the land, how they tried to break the Indigenous people from the land by basically very purposefully trying to damage or destroy their cultures. And I realized I was getting sucked into a bigger story. So when I first went up there, it was for a 3-week trip. I felt like on that first trip, I just didn't get the material I needed. I felt like the story was much bigger than I had realized. I went to do a story about resource extraction. I realized it was about colonialism. And the questions I was asking, I was making some inroads, but they seemed to open up more questions. People had told me, for example, it was often white people had told me, don't bring up residential schools. You're going to be bringing up people's trauma. And I wasn't really bringing up residential schools. That was sort of the elephant in the room. People would mention it. And when I finally sort of said, are you willing to talk about it? I found that people were willing to talk about it. I mean, carefully, perhaps. In any case, that first 3-week trip was not enough. And I realized I had to go back. And I felt like I was a bit more prepared the second time around. I no longer had preconceived notions that, as I did, that Indigenous people were sort of a monolith that were against resource extraction, just point blank. It was much more complicated than that. And so I wanted to explore these different strands and just pursue some of the ideas I developed in the first trip in the second one. And it just became sort of a deeper experience. And I have to say, it was people like Paul that made it work for me. Because you get scattered ideas of what's going on, but it's the people themselves who present things in front of you, and you sort of just grab onto them. For example, I had specifically set up an interview with Paul, whom I hadn't met before, to talk about residential schools. And he started telling me not about residential schools, but about what life was like on the land. And of course, I'd had scattered ideas about this from people who told me little bits and pieces. But I realized I was sitting with someone who could just in a very eloquent way describe what it was like growing up on the land and what that meant and how it developed him and his community, how it developed him as a person and what it meant. And of course, you have to understand that to understand what the residential schools took away and what resource extraction and colonialism has taken away. And after that conversation with Paul, I realized what a gift I'd got from him, but I realized how to frame the book, because Paul actually had suggested how to frame the book. You start at the beginning, which is what it was like to grow up on the land, and then you can get into what it meant to be pulled away from the land, how the connection with the land was, there was an attempt made to rub that out in the residential schools, how difficult it was then to reestablish yourself with the land again, what that meant to the communities, and then go from there. So I really have to thank Paul for that. There are other people who really helped me frame a lot of things. People like Dolphus Jumbo in Trout Lake showed me how residential schools even had inhibited the way Dene leaders understood themselves and their communities. As he told me, residential schools sort of developed people to be followers, to only talk when they were called upon, to be regimented, which is obviously, I mean, Paul can speak to this, has nothing to do with the Dene way of doing things. I appreciate what Hilary said about the circular nature of the book, but again, those aren't things you sort of know so much as they're sort of given to you and you sort of see them. And what Paul had described to me about being in a circle, I thought that was the most sort of such a beautiful way of describing how an individual can be an individual within the community and how the community can also be strong at the same time. Those two things can work together. It's not a matter of being an individual and or emphasizing the community. Those two things were linked. So yes, that when I was speaking to Eugene Bollinger later, it was actually amazing that he said that about feeling the circle was closed and describing many things about growing up and about finally understanding what it might mean to be a Dene man, a Dene person, and how he has a connection with the past and he has a connection with the future. And I realized it was sort of would be great to have the other person who suggested the circle, Paul, alongside Eugene in that last chapter, because you have the young person and the elder. And I think one thing I learned is how that relationship is really important, how the elders are really respected and trusted and can pass down information. These are the sorts of things that the residential schools were trying to break and destroy. But when we meet someone like Paul and some others there, you'll see that the Dene people are very resilient. Now, you had mentioned, Hilary, how remote this idea that the people and their ways were very remote to me. Well, it's sort of true in a way. I mean, when I've been in Gaza, I'm around Muslims, and I know in the West we tend to think that Muslims are very different from us, but actually we're all from the same Abrahamic faith, and there's a lot of connections and there's a lot of relationships between us and them. Our histories are very intertwined. We've been rivals, enemies at times, or whatever you want to say, but the connections are deep and we're kind of from the same root. It's interesting doing what, I mean, you could argue is some sort of an anthropological work like this one, where I'm trying to understand the Dene, but realize actually, in the end, if you're really paying attention, you realize that a lot of what you're seeing and what you're hearing reflects on yourself. You begin to say, well, there's a mirror that's being held up to to me and to where I'm from. And I was really struck with this idea of paying the land. The idea that people would go there and before they begin, you know, putting up a tent or hunting or whatever, they give something to the land. They give a gift. It's a token perhaps, but what it speaks to is this idea of reciprocity with the land, with the natural world. And, you know, to be honest, that's something that is really foreign to my way of thinking of land. I mean, I grew up as all the people of the book, in other words, the Bible, grew up believing that the land was given to us so that we can subdue it, and that everything on the land, all the creatures, everything on it belongs to us. It's for us. And over time, I began to it really began to sink in this Dene way of thinking of the land as not something that you subdue or that you own in that John Lockean way, but as something that owns you, that you're part of. And that probably speaks to one of the reasons I wanted to draw the natural landscapes in a detailed way. It's the same reason I try to draw faces in a detailed way, because as you suggested yourself, I mean, land is a character. It's so much a part of the Dene people. I wanted to somehow reflect that as best I could by really trying to capture something of its majesty. So there's that, I guess. I mean, the other, I've made some notes, but I've been scribbling them all over this page. One thing Paul mentioned was how I got people to talk about difficult social things. It wasn't always easy, and not everyone necessarily wanted to talk about some things. I never pushed. I mean, I learned not to push. I've learned not to push a long time ago, but it's only when people were willing to talk about some of those events that those interviews went forward. People were extremely generous with me. I learned something. One of the things I learned that I haven't been too good about in previous interviews, but I sort of learned when I was with Indigenous communities was, especially when older people are speaking, when elders are speaking, you listen and you don't interrupt. And, you know, I go back on some of my old interviews that I did in Gaza and other places, and I'm always surprised at how often I kind of undermine the interview by interjecting myself often. And in the case of, for example, the interview with Paul, by the time I got to that interview, I knew enough to let him speak, because it was going to go where it was going to go, and maybe I could learn from that. And I think I did. So, you know, I was a little, especially at the very beginning, I was quite intimidated, because sometimes elders would tell me, no, I don't want you to record, and I don't want you to take notes. And so sometimes I would listen to someone talk for an hour and a half, and then I would go back to my room and I would try to assemble as best I could to paraphrase basically what they'd said. And then the best I could do after that was to go back to them and say, I wrote this down. Do you understand what I'm doing? I'm trying to get the story down. So can you confirm some of this? But the truth was that became a little too difficult. That's not, you know, as much as I have to respect the way people wanted to give the information to me, I also had to sort of honor the story by getting it as accurately as possible. So I would try more to explain myself and what I was trying to do. And really I learned not to be so, let's say, intimidated by being around a culture that I didn't have as much understanding of, and just sort of be myself. And I think that helped me, especially on the second trip. I was much more myself then. Every now and then I got pushback. I did an interview with Stephen Kakfwi, who was ended up being a premier of the Northwest Territories. And I think I bugged him a little too much by calling to sort of set up the interview. And when I finally showed up at his door, he said, "Why were you trying so hard to reach me? I mean, you tried." He was like kind of a little, he was hard on me. Let's just say that. And of course, I understood that. I mean, I immediately sort of realized that I probably had pushed things a little too hard, and I was willing to walk away. I wasn't sure he wanted to do the interview. But I think I just got him with the first question, which was, what politicized you? And suddenly I was sort of on his territory and on his domain, and he was completely gracious and eloquent and gave me what I thought was a great interview. So, I mean, you learn from your mistakes. It's not just a question of being really good at what you do. You sort of have to roll with your mistakes somehow. Anyway, I think maybe that's enough of from me at this point, but I really do appreciate you being here, Hilary, and your insights. And I really appreciate Paul. It's the first time I've really spoken to Paul, except for the tech run through since the book came out. So I was always really nervous about that opening chapter and what I had got wrong and what I had gotten right. So Paul's affirmation really deeply meant a lot to me.
Thank you to all of those wonderful contributions about the book. I'm really grateful too that Hilary showed us some of the images. If you haven't seen the book already, it is incredibly engrossing. Art Spiegelman's right that it sucks you in immediately with its intensity. So I'm very glad that you talked us through, you gave us some close readings of particular pages. There's so many questions I'd love to ask you all, and I hope that we'll have Paul rejoining us in a moment so we can hear some more from him. I was just going to ask you about the way you draw yourself in this book. You seem to be in a quieter position here. There's a few scenes where you're cartoony Joe with the glasses and the caricature, but for the most part, you're very quiet, you're reserved, you're kind of off scene in some places in the book. There's also the interesting kind of self-reflexive moment where you say, what's the difference between me and an oil company? We've both come here to extract something. I wonder if you could just say anything about that as our questions start rolling in from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, a woman in Toledo, where Paul is from, a researcher had told me, you've got to look at yourself through the lens of colonialism, which I really sort of resisted. I mean, I thought journalist coming in, trying his best to get this story, that kind of thing in a way. But yeah, it's sort of true. You are a stranger coming, asking a lot of questions, and you have to be aware of your part in the whole settler colonial project. I mean, what was interesting also about doing the book and reflecting on stories like Paul's and others is I had to begin to think about myself living here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm an immigrant to this country in the sense, like, my ancestry in this country does not go back to the Pilgrims or, Plymouth Rock or the Mayflower or anything like that. I mean, it's relatively recent. But I think you have to situate yourself. It's not so much, I think you have to sort of ask for forgiveness as sort of really understand where you are located in the scheme of history and the scheme of things. And I had to sort of, this helped me realize that I might not have been an original settler, but it was settlers that paved my way. I mean, the reason I'm living where I live in the Pacific Northwest, where indigenous peoples lived, is because it had all been paved for me on the way. And so I can live a certain lifestyle because of what's happened historically to take something away. And I have to be aware of that. And it's not something I can reconcile completely. I mean, I can never sort of take those things away, but it's just to be aware of it. And when Deb Simmons told me that, it was the first sort of inkling that, oh, okay, I'm part of this settler picture too. It's not just a question of just coming in and getting a story. It's like, how am I going to look at myself? Now, there was the first part of your question, which I think I lost the thread of.
What was it? It was how you position yourself in this comic.
Oh,
I suppose.
I think if you look at all my work, I mean, over time, from the original book Palestine that I did, that first book, those were a lot of disparate stories, and I was kind of the thread running through them. And it was a bit more gonzo sort of journalism. But as time's gone by in my books, you'll see I'm much less of a character. I think that's been sort of a general inclination. And especially when I was in the Northwest Territories, I mean, the characters I was talking to, I think you can see, were so strong. And the landscape itself was just a much bigger thing than anything I'd encountered before, that I don't think I needed to be part of the story. To me, I'd like to be part of the story anytime it sort of reflects on something about the West. I'm sort of a stand-in for the West in a certain sense, or when your relationships with people bring something to light. You know, when it's the actual personal contact you're having that is saying something about the people you're communicating with.
And in general, this book seems to have had quite a profound impact on you working on this project.
It really did. It really did. I mean, the other thing to mention is that, you know, I wanted to get away from conflict journalism. I've just had enough of drawing that sort of stuff. But I soon realized, doing the story about what happened to Indigenous people in Canada, there are other forms of violence. And there are other forms of violence, in this particular case, violence imposed on children, and actually getting children to impose violence on each other, that had, you know, severe repercussions and continue to have severe repercussions. So it made me understand that in some ways you can't get away from conflict. But what it made me understand about colonialism is it doesn't sort of just end at a point when there's a commission that will, you know, tie things up sort of and say, yes, this was cultural genocide. Yes, let's pay a certain amount of money to the victims. I mean, those might be good things, but really the violence spools out over the generations and its effects will continue. And, you know, it's always a relief to meet people like Paul, who are so resilient and who can impart a lot of their knowledge upon younger people. And you realize, no, this story isn't over. There is a pushback, there is resistance. It might not be resistance as we know it, let's say in the Palestinian territories or in other places I might have gone to, but it's a different kind of resistance. It's a cultural resistance.
And there's a hopefulness in that sense, why you end the book with a new generation.
I think so.
We should go to questions. It's absolutely fascinating. I hope we'll be able to pull Hilary in too, and to say thank you to Patrick Scott in the audience for telling us that Paul is having internet disruption. Hopefully he's now rejoining us. So,
hi, Patrick.
And Paul is back. So we have a question from Frida Heitland in the audience, one of my students. She says, Professor Chute talked about the interiority of the page with the revenge fantasy. Is that right? Mr. Sacco, as a comics journalist, how do you go about trying to externalize someone else's interiority when that person is non-fictional? And what role do you think the other's internal world plays in journalism?
That's interesting. Well, I mean, the sort of journalism I do always has one foot in the subjective. I mean, when I'm telling someone's story, I'm trying to be accurate, especially as far as the quotes go, things like that. So when I'm drawing Paul's story, for example, I did as much research as I could on how a Muskin boat was built, researching archives, things like that. So I try to be accurate in those kinds of ways. But then when you're drawing is just naturally subjective. And drawing does take you, or it can take you into an interior place. And that to me is the point where that journalism part starts to blend with the artistic part, and you become sort of more of an artist. Your drawing itself is just a subjective act, but then you are letting yourself sort of show what you can imagine of that person's interior life. There's a scene in my Palestine book where I have someone talking about being interrogated by the Israelis, and I wasn't there in the cell with me, but he's talking about his experiences, and I realized what as I was drawing it, I'm thinking this was such a claustrophobic story. So I started bringing the panels and making them smaller and smaller to sort of compress that individual. And there are things you sort of do. If someone tells you a fantasy they had, you try to bring it to life. It might not be how that person thought of his fantasy about tying up this person who had abused him and letting him be devoured by wolves. I mean, I guess the problem with what I do, and I guess it does create a certain tension, which I haven't really ever been able to resolve, is I always worry that when I draw people's stories that I might be pouring concrete over them, and that my way of drawing those stories is actually going to become their way of thinking of their stories. I hope that's not the case. It's one person's attempt to tell a story.
And I wonder if we could pull Paul in there, as Paul is with us, and ask what your experiences is of reading the book, how the book has been received by your community, what the impact you think the book will have.
Well, first of all, let me apologize. I'm having all sorts of problems with my internet here. That's a wonderful place we live in, but we do have some technological challenges, and apologies for disappearing. I don't usually do that. We're visual people. The people that I come from, we teach our children, there's no how to skin a moose boat. There's no how to build a moose skin boat book. We teach our children by visually, and we teach them to look at, around, listen, smell, and do very little talking. And one of the things that about journalism in comic books, I think, is that it really does teach us, the image of somebody holding out a baby. You can't replace that any other way. You can't describe that and say, and building a moose-skin boat. What I try to say on every time I talk about moose-skin boat is that, they have a good axe, they have a good knife, a 3-pronged needle, and the rest of the stuff comes from the land. And you can't really see that until you see that there's nothing there, and all of a sudden there's a 40-foot boat there. And that's the kind of thing I think that he captured, and I think a lot of people have a sense about that, because visually it really does present the kind of things that we didn't see. Some of the social problems that we're talking about. Again, it's really difficult to talk about them, but once you see them, it does present that image. But I don't think it presents Joe's image of the issue, but it's Joe's interpretation of what he's heard. And I think that's the important part. The other thing that I think really is that what we've tried to do is that,
I think we've just lost Paul, haven't we?
What was the last thing he was saying?
It was just about how the book is presented.
Right. But the sentence. Okay, I just didn't catch it. I guess it was on the fritz.
But I was going to come to you, Hilary, and say, would you like to add anything to this conversation, or is there any way you can put Paying the Land in the sort of how it fits into Joe's wider work, as a scholar of his work? Where do you see it?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's so many things to say, but I think one thing that I would love Joe to mention to you and to hear your thoughts on. I hate to quote you back at you, but it's something that you said also about continuity and drawing, which is obviously something I'm really interested in. But you said last summer in that talk with Art Spiegelman that the same hand drawing the images of the past and the present gives or indicates a kind of continuity for what you're drawing. And, you know, I think all of your work, I would say, is about the past and the present and their relationship, connection, dynamic. And at some level, all of your work is about trauma, I would say. And I'm wondering if that idea that the same hand drawing the past and the present, indicating a continuity, has any different kind of resonance for you with this particular book than it does with your other books, since continuity, like Eugene, you know, is expressing at the end when he talks about feeling like he's on a continuum with his ancestors, is such an important part of the Dene worldview.
Yeah, continuity has always been sort of important. And I mean, the way I like to describe it is, if I had a photograph, let's say a photograph of from the 1930s of people building a moose skin boat, and I had a photograph of Paul Andrew now building a moose skin boat, the technology would be quite clearly different, because it would have a black and white photograph and sort of a pristine, you know, very high resolution color photograph next to each other. And I think what happens there is you can sort of see the connection, but the past always seems like the past. Mm-hmm. It always seems like that was the black and white period or whatever it is. And when you're drawing scenes, so when you're drawing a scene of Paul Andrew in his circle, in his community, and you're drawing a scene of Eugene Boulanger in modern times, showing people from the past doing the same sorts of things, the fact that you're drawing with the same hand, it's the same sort of line of ink. What's happening there is you're showing the connection. I mean, the connection should be, it's not sort of, you're not hitting the reader over the head with it. It's just that I think the reader is I'm
exactly. A show and tell person. I'm just showing everyone this page because I think it's a great example of what you're talking about. Don't mind me.
Yeah, and I don't think it's that people understand the connection. I think it's not even clear to them that there was never a disconnection between the past and the present.
Right. That's so interesting.
And I think, and in particular in this book and in all books I've done, I guess the past obviously matters. I mean, in the book on Gaza, it's things that happened in 1956, how they're in a continuum with what's happening today. And in this particular book, it's the past and the present are also intermingled. They one informs the other. I mean, yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That was so interesting.
I'm so sorry we've lost Paul.
I hope we have him rejoin us in a moment. Let's hope so. We have a few questions from the audience. We'll try and get through these. So Patrick McCabe asks Joe.
Hi, Patty. Patty was my student.
As a reporter, are there ever any instances in which one person's testimony or memory of any event directly conflicts with another? He says Art Spiegelman deals with this issue a bit in Mouse when his father denies the existence of the well-documented orchestra at Auschwitz. If so, how do you go about negotiating this issue in your comics?
Well, this is a subject that came up a lot in my book Footnotes in Gaza, because I talked to many older people about the same event, and in some cases, people told very different versions of the same story. And I decided finally that it wasn't really up to me to reconcile those stories, more than just to present them as I heard them and to throw the problem back on the reader in a way and say, here are different stories. I can't really reconcile these things, but ultimately the arc of their stories come to the same conclusion. So the arc of the story is sort of the same. It's just things that happened in between, their own personal memories or on the way might be different, but they generally tell the same story. It's always been an interesting, it's an interesting thing that happens when you're researching things like this. And I think that the main thing to do is not so much to bring stories together and sort of hammer one meta narrative. There are many narratives that tell the same story, essentially.
Thank you. And an interesting question from Rosemary Jose. How do you manage to delve into their vulnerabilities without losing your ethical anchor or compass? I think she means the people you're interviewing.
How do I manage?
And I suppose how you keep your distance, I suppose, is one way of phrasing that.
Keeping distance. Well, the thing is, I keep my distance, I think, more when I'm interviewing people and sort of in the field. It's sort of the journalistic thing to try to get the story down as accurately as possible and to not let the story itself affect you if it's a affecting story. But when you're drawing, that's when you have to sort of inhabit that person's story. You're no longer trying to get the facts so much as try to understand how that person might have felt within those facts, because you're drawing that person. And so that's when you don't have as much distance. The drawing is when I have less distance from my subjects in many ways.
And Hilary, do you want to bring in anything on that? You did such a wonderful job of talking about the images and the intense detail in this book. I'm really glad you brought up the scene in the diamond mine. That's such a key moment.
Actually, it's a gold mine, but
sorry, gold mine.
Well, okay, I always have maybe too much to say. I don't want to run down the clock since we have about five minutes. But I do, I'm so interested in thinking about drawing and conceptualizing drawing and thinking about drawing as a way of thinking, which is something that the cartoonist Chris Ware has talked about. And I'm also always really interested in thinking about drawing as a form of ethical connection. So Joe, I was just fascinated, and I'm doing the thing that's so un-Dene, right? I'm like taking tons of notes. I feel like I have to come clean on that. I'm such a note taker, but this idea that when you're reporting stories, the part of the stories that have to do with suffering, for example, like physical suffering, might not be ones that feel as acute to you. You're being a journalist, you're getting the story, and it's later when you're drawing those stories and giving them a sort of material shape that for you feel the most profoundly affected in terms of, say, thinking about another person's suffering. I think that's really, really, really interesting. And this idea of inhabiting another person's experience. And, this is something that I think runs throughout all of your work. I found this book really hard to read. For those of you in the audience, we were having this conversation right before we started, and Joe was saying he found parts of this book hard to do. It's obviously harder to live through them, as Paul Andrew did, right? But the section on the residential schools was really hard for me to read. And I imagine it was hard for you to draw. And is it that you have to feel like you are that body to capture that body with lines and marks? I don't know, I'd be interested to hear anything else you have to say about, what that experience of drawing feels like to you at a really granular level.
Well, that's a hard one. I mean, the only way, if you're going to liken it to something else, I would say it's like maybe like an actor. tries
Right.
to get into a part. I mean, you're trying, obviously with great deficiencies, you're trying to, I guess you're trying to be as empathetic as possible and trying to understand that feeling. And I think it's important to make that effort because people have really honored you with their stories. That's how I see it. I've troubled these people. In some cases, I've had them bring up things, and sometimes they're pushing themselves to tell me their stories. And the best way to honor that is to be as present as possible. That's all I can sort of say about it, really. As present as possible when I'm drawing. In other words, as present, as close to their experience as I can get, being obviously not having had that experience. But it's not something that it's just something you feel. It's a very emotional thing and not a cerebral one at all.
And is part of it that you're, oh, I'm sorry, Alice, go ahead.
Well, just very quickly to follow up on some of the questions that are coming in related to this. Esther Sepp says, I have a follow-up question on distance and vulnerability. Joe, you were close to them.
Hey, Esther.
You were close to them while drawing your subjects. How can you stop or exit that connection? How overwhelming is it? I think you're kind of speaking to that, right?
Well, you're always aware, yes, I guess so. But I mean, you're always aware that, I mean, in some places you go to, like Gaza, where people are really trapped. And I'm very aware of my ability to get out of that situation. So as much as I really try to get into a position of understanding and sort of feeling what other people may have felt on some level, those people live with it in a way, people who've been traumatized live with it in a way that I will never live with it. I can always distance myself in other ways. I mean, the Dene people have gone through so much that I cannot know or fathom, and will continue to go through those things. Whereas I can, I mean, you know, I have the luxury of switching my focus to something else.
And Patrick Scott has a comment in the audience. I would suggest that you can't keep your distance and get the story. Connecting requires engagement, and engagement means trust to have the gift of the story given. Joe engaged, yes, at some level distance, but people trusted him, so he was profoundly connected.
That's really nice of Patrick to say. I mean, Patrick's in the book and was incredibly helpful. He really helped me understand the whole land claims, what was going on with land claims and just sort of internal politics. So actually such a pleasure to hear from Patrick. That's very kind of him to say. People were very generous with me, though. I have to say that people were incredibly generous with me. So it was just a matter of connecting with that and letting them be generous with me.
And shall we return to Hilary? You were going to say something, Hilary.
I have that, we're almost out of time, so I would much rather hear from others than I have so many questions, it could go on and on.
Okay, I'm going to ask one final question from the audience. Patrick Scott has just added, Paul just texted to say he has no service now and sends his apologies. So please tell him we're very sorry to have lost him too, and we hope to bring him to the RAI again at some point. So Hiya, she says, a question for Joe. You mentioned parallels between extraction companies and your reporting and your ambivalence about it. These are emotions you've also expressed in your conflict journalism. And I was wondering if you could talk about how these ambivalences manifest differently in relation to the violence you're covering. Fantastical military violence versus the slow violence associated with extraction, especially in relation to your role as journalist and storyteller.
Hi, it's good to hear from you. That's a hard question. I guess it goes back to something I was talking about earlier, where I wanted to do this story to almost have a break from the military component, physical violence, drawing AK-47s, what bombs do to people, massacres in that sense. But actually, the troubling thing about doing this book was realizing the sort of violence that is impressed upon people in other ways. And as a journalist, I just had to try to understand that, because and try to present it as best I could, because it's not enough to talk about the residential schools. You have to talk then about what that did to the people, how beating kids when they spoke their own languages was going to affect them later when they went to their communities and could no longer speak with their grandparents, for example. They could no longer speak their indigenous languages, and how that would break culture and the pain of that, and how, of course, that leads to an atomization that expressed itself in things like drug abuse or alcoholism. I mean, you have to understand how one thing is the result of the other and how things sort of develop. So in some ways, with this story, it was a complicated sort of violence and a really insidious one. It's not one that is about a wound that can be patched up.
Do we have a final word from Hilary? Would you like to say anything at the end?
I think the final word should be from Joe, for sure.
Well, I'd also like to ask Joe to tell us what he's working on right now.
Okay. Well, I wish the final word was from Paul. I think we were very lucky to have Paul here, and I wish we could have heard more from him. A pleasure. It's just a pleasure seeing you all, and I'm glad the book has had some good impact. That's good to hear. What I'm working on now is the Rolling Stones book. Again, because I guess, this book, the book Paying the Land, was difficult. I've needed to shift focus. But I find even my Rolling Stones book, which is not really about the Rolling Stones, just ends up being about a lot of things that have been troubling me about humans behave toward each other. So I always feel I'm getting pulled in that direction, almost no matter what why I pick up the pen. It always ends up being about the same sorts of things.
So I do want to give the last word to Joe, but we have a very nice comment from Deborah Simmons in the audience. And she says, this is not a question, but rather a comment from the Satu region, the setting of Paul's stories. I just want to say Masi Cho to Paul, Joe, Hilary, and Alice for this discussion. I found myself in turns nodding vigorously and very emotional. Hilary is so right to say it's a difficult book to read, including for a non-Indigenous settler like myself, living the predicament of a very present colonial reality and witnessing the strength and vitality of the Indigenous people in their beautiful landscape. This was brought home to me with the disastrous spring flooding just experienced in communities along the Mackenzie River. People have found ways to support each other and rebuild, which seems like a really nice place to end this really wonderful discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists. Paul, who's not here, we hope to bring him back to the RAI in the future. Hilary, thank you so much. Joe, thank you for being here. I'm so pleased to bring you back to the RAI. Thank you to everyone in the audience for all of those wonderful questions. And to our tech person, Mitch, who's working away behind the scenes, making sure everything works smoothly. If you'd like to buy a copy of this book, please do. I'm sure this discussion has made everyone want to go away and read this. And we've partnered with Blackwell Oxford, if you're in the UK, to get a discount on the book. We'd also like to give a shout out to our friends, Haya and Dom Davies, who are running a conference with Hilary on the 9th and 10th of June. That is called Crisis Lines, Coloniality, Modernity, Comics. And I think Mitch has dropped into the chat how to sign up for that conference. So all that's left to say is thank you so much for being here, everybody, and good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Pat.